Today I'm going to talk about the philosophical foundations of the American Revolution and the ideas that persuaded Americans to transform from loyal supporters of the king to rebels in a period of roughly about 13 years. So the colonial America that we read about in chapters 2 and 3 produced three significant movements that impacted the beliefs of the colonists and the founding fathers. The first movement that you need to know is the Great Awakening. So the Great Awakening emphasized individual thinking and taught people to challenge authority. It also weakened the power of some of the established churches in the colonies, such as the Anglican Church or the Church of England. The second major idea that you need to know is this idea of republicanism. So republicanism is a political philosophy based on the idea of popular sovereignty, or that the power of government should flow from the people. Republicanism emphasized liberty and civic virtue. This idea gained momentum in the years before the American Revolution and conflicted with the colonists' loyalty to the king. The third, and perhaps maybe the most important, was the Enlightenment. This was a philosophical movement that emphasized the use of science and reason to solve problems. Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke argued that people had natural rights, or rights that they were born with that could not be taken away. These rights included life, liberty, and property. So, how did these ideas shape the way that Americans thought about their relationship with Great Britain in the years leading up to the Revolution? Let's take a look. So, starting with the French and Indian War, we have to understand that in 1763, it is really hard for us to imagine that the colonists would ever rebel. As time went on, however, some colonists began to question this loyalty to the king. In the 1760s, tensions between the colonies and the British Crown over issues such as taxation, quartering of soldiers, and a lot of the things that previous teachers already talked about really helped make republicanism a more popular idea within America. The idea of taxation without representation, for example, was a call for greater power in the hands of the people. Okay, so by 1773, the year of the Boston Tea Party, there were really three distinct trains of thought on the relationship between the British government and the colonies. So the first one is this idea of being a radical. And radicals were people who favored breaking away from Great Britain. Radicals included figures like John Adams, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry. And radicals formed groups like the Sons of Liberty and were very active in opposing the British rule in the colonies. But like radicals, at least at the start of this process, were not the majority. Another group that you should know are the moderates. And moderates were colonists who disagreed with British policies after the French and Indian War, but they felt that reconciliation with Great Britain was the best course of action. The third group is loyalists. And loyalists were people who sided with the British government. Loyalists tended to agree with British taxation policies and accepted British authority in the colonies. Loyalists tended to be wealthier colonists as well as people whose jobs were linked to the British government, such as tax collectors, Anglican ministers, and members of direct members of colonial governments like governors. Okay. Most colonists, as I said, early on were actually more moderate. And they favored reconciliation to like the radicals who eventually sought independence. We can especially see this in the years directly leading up to the signing of the Declaration of Independence. For example, after the Intolerable Acts, there was a call for a moderate response with the formation of the First Continental Congress in 1774. So the First Continental Congress was a meeting of 12 of the 13 colonies to discuss a response to the Intolerable Acts and the escalation of tension between the colonies and the British government. If we look at the actions that the First Continental Congress actually took, they're geared more towards fixing the relationship with Great Britain than fighting for independence. Out of the First Continental Congress came the Declaration and Resolves, or the Declaration of Rights, which was a petition sent directly to the king that outlined the colonists' objections to the Intolerable Acts. More importantly, the colonists took important steps in becoming more unified by forming a group called the Association. And the Association called for complete boycotts of British goods throughout all of the colonies. Now, both of these things argue for a return to their former relationship as opposed to maybe a complete break from Great Britain. unfortunately, tensions between Britain and the colonies continued to deteriorate. So in the spring of 1775, fighting had broken out between British soldiers and American rebels at Lexington and Concord, and it appeared that the colonies were on the brink of war. So that takes us to the Second Continental Congress. And the Second Continental Congress really was of two minds here. So the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia a month after the bloodshed at Lexington and Concord. Surprisingly, there was still not a clear consensus on how to respond to the British government. In fact, the Second Continental Congress simultaneously took steps to prepare for war, while at the same time professing their loyalty to the king. We see this so that on the one hand, for example, the Second Continental Congress began to raise money to create an army and a navy, which is a clear act of war. At the head of that army, they placed George Washington, and he was put in charge of the army that was already forming to rebel against the British near Boston. Okay, he would join that army shortly after the fighting that took place at Bunker Hill. On the other hand, at the same time they're preparing for war, what we see the Second Continental Congress doing is making arrangements for peace. So in July of 1775, Continental Congress adopts the Olive Branch Petition, which was directed directly to the king. And in the Olive Branch Petition, which was supported by moderates throughout the Continental Congress, such as John Dickinson, the colonies declared their loyalty to the king and asked that the king, King George III, end the hostilities between Great Britain and the colonies. Now, a month later, in August of 1775, King George III rejects the Olive Branch Petition and declares the colonies an open rebellion, which means that the British government now views the rebels as traitors. Okay, so even at this juncture, in 1775, there is not clear consensus that America needs to rebel. So that takes us to kind of a turning point in American history. Over the next few months, a series of events actually take place that shift the thinking of many colonists towards independence. Gradually, the colonies became more radical and began to trade their loyalty to the crown for new ideas of republicanism and independence. First, the colonists were impacted by the growing fighting that was happening between the colonists and the British, especially the fact that the war had escalated and actually shifted to Canada in 1775. But even more important was that they were persuaded by the release of an influential pamphlet titled Common Sense by this man who's pictured here, Thomas Paine. And he released that pamphlet in the beginning of 1776. So Thomas Paine had immigrated to the United States from Britain in 1775. And he argued that the decision to declare independence was, as the title suggests, common sense. In his pamphlets, he used Enlightenment ideas to argue why the colonies should break away. Additionally, Paine called for the establishment of a republican form of government where political power was in the hands of the people. These arguments spoke to the colonists, and Common Sense became an overwhelming bestseller, selling over 120,000 copies throughout the colonies in just a matter of months. Common Sense helped to persuade Americans to become more radical and push for independence. So the Second Continental Congress responds to Thomas Paine and his push for independence. And so in the summer of 1776, a committee that included John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, as well as others, and of course Thomas Jefferson, were responsible for creating a formal Declaration of Independence, and the adoption of that document took place on July 4th, 1776, which is the day that we celebrate Independence Day today. So Thomas Jefferson was the primary author, and he borrowed heavily from John Locke and the ideas of the Enlightenment. In the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson argued that all men were born with inalienable or natural rights, and that these rights included life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson believed that King George III in Parliament had repeatedly violated these natural rights, and the majority of the Declaration is actually a list of grievances that the colonists had with the British government. So the Declaration of Independence is perhaps maybe the most important document in American history. Not only does it make clear the intentions of the American Revolution, and it inspires Americans to rebel within its own time period, but it also established many of the philosophies and ideals that would come to define the United States today as we know it. So the emphasis on the Enlightenment and natural rights would become a fundamental part of the first governments established in the United States, including state constitutions, and then the later U.S. Constitution and its Bill of Rights, which would be ratified in 1789. Perhaps more importantly, it created a mission statement that our country still strives to fulfill today. There's no denying there's a certain amount of hypocrisy embedded in Jefferson's words and some of the things that he wrote in the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson himself was a slave owner, and yet in the Declaration of Independence, he proclaims that all men are created equal. As we will see, the promise of equality is never fully realized during the American Revolution, with groups such as slaves, free blacks, Native Americans, landless whites, and women being denied the rights in the new government that's formed afterwards. However, the promise of liberty and equality comes from the Declaration of Independence is something that continues to inspire generations of people, not only in this country, but in the world all over.